Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 8, recorded July 2018. This is the Trek Profiles Podcast, where each episode we sit down with a Star Trek fan. We learn their story and we try to figure out why this show means so much to them, to us, and to all of you. I am John, your intrepid host of this whole enterprise, and I welcome you to this, the Trek Profiles Podcast, Episode 8. If you wish to get in touch with us, you can reach us at feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at TrekProfiles. If you wish to leave us a voicemail, you may leave a message at our automated voicemail line at 609-512-LLAP. That's 609-512-5527. Warning, as we record this, we have reached the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, so all previous Trek content up to and including that point is fair game and may be discussed on this episode. You have been warned, human. As always, by my side, right here with me, is the amazing, dazzling, and dizzying M5 Multitronic unit.
M5 standing by.
M5, display all the messages and communiques.
M5 acknowledges.
The Trek Profiles Podcast is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network. There is literally something for everyone at Tricorder if you're a Star Trek fan. You can check out our amazing Shore Leave podcast, which is all about Star Trek conventions, specifically STLV, although we've covered a lot more conventions than just STLV. You can also listen to Reading Trek, where William and Marty talk about novels in the Star Trek universe. It's a super fun show. Also, we have a weekly news show called Weekly Trek, where we give you a rundown of any weekly Trek news that's occurred in the fandom or with the production of the new shows or novels or online games or whatever there happens to be out there. We usually have a rotating panel of hosts. It's a lot of fun, so why not give us a listen? If you enjoy this or any of these other shows and you wish to support the network, you may do so through Patreon. Supporting the network gets you early access, unedited episodes, and other goodies. Every penny that we get goes right back into the network so that we can continue to make great content for you, our wonderful Patreon supporters. Tricorder is also going to be in full effect for Star Trek Las Vegas this year. Many of our hosts will be carrying collectible pins that you can ask for on a first-come, first-served basis, of course. We'll also be running some parties, including our Night of Diversity on Saturday night, which will be truly epic with some amazing raffles and prizes, the proceeds of which will go 100% to two LGBT charities, a local one here in Las Vegas called The Center, and another one in Chicago, which is called The Crib. It's a youth shelter. So these are some great charities. So come on out, support them, and have a great time with your Star Trek friends. Another way you can support this or any of our shows is to visit the show page in iTunes and please give us a nice rating and review. And if you aren't an iTunes user, that's okay too. We'd appreciate your rating and review in whatever platform you use. The only reason we ask for those ratings and reviews is that it helps the network become more visible, and we just feel that there's probably some Star Trek fans out there who don't know about our content, and we'd love for them to be able to discover our shows. We appreciate it so very much. Thank you. All right, Kobayashi Maru time. These are the questions from Episode 6 with Dan Davidson. Question 1, which is the snazzier uniform, the blue Season 1 Discovery sets or the Star Trek movie Monster Maroons? Dan said the Monster Maroons, but you all selected the Discovery Blues by 52 to 48%. I did not expect it to come out that way, but hey, that's part of the Kobayashi Maru. Question 2, which is the better episode of the animated series, Yesteryear or More Tribbles, More Trouble? Dan said Yesteryear, and so did all of you by 71 to 29%. Question 3, pick a Klingon to fight hand-to-hand, Kang, Koloth, or Kor. This one was pretty tight, with 27% for Kang, 30% for Koloth, and 43% for Kor, which Dan also picked. Kapla on all your battles then. Kor looks forward to meeting you all. There may even be songs sung of the battle. Question 4. Human play Domjot or Bajoran play Spring Ball? Dan picked Domjot, but the listeners were split 50-50 on this one, which I thought was surprising. I expected Domjot to totally dominate, but somehow that just shows you never know, and that shows the unpredictability of the Kobayashi Maru test. Well done, M5.
M5 acknowledges.
Question 5. You're a single man in the Star Trek future. You need a date, so you join the 24th century version of Tinder. You get 2 matches and you have to pick one. Who will enjoy a lovely evening of Tullaberry wine and dancing? Dan's 2 choices were Kai Wynn and the Borg Queen. Dan picked the Borg Queen, and she dominated this poll at 81 to 19%. Congratulations to all of you and the listenership as well on your eventual assimilation. Well, that's that, M5. Let's run the show.
Working.
His favorite character is Major Kira. His favorite ship is the Enterprise E, and he is currently rewatching TNG and just finished his Discovery rewatch. You can find him on the Twitter at TrekFan4747. He is from the Sun City in the Lone Star State. That's El Paso, Texas, North America Earth in Sector 001. It's Justin Oser. Welcome, Justin, and thanks for being on my podcast.
Hey, great to be here. And you gave the nickname of the city I live in, the Sun City. So thank you. Not many people do that.
That's all part of the prep we do right here at the Trek Profiles podcast, man. I tell people sometimes they send me an email or, I'm talking to guests and they're like, oh, can we record next week? Or, it's really good for me if we could record today or whatever. I was like, no, that's not how we roll up in here, man, because I do all this crazy prep. And so I always try to put a little bit of local flavor to honor my guests and honor wherever they're from. So you're more than welcome for that. But Justin, I got to tell you, it's time for question 1, my man. Are you a Star Trek fan?
Absolutely. It's actually a really big part of my life every single day.
In what way?
Well, it's pretty constant. Now, this maybe goes into how I became a Star Trek fan, but it's something that like every day I'm watching Star Trek, thinking about it, thinking of the future that it envisions, interacting with people online about it. I've been constantly reading Star Trek novels for almost 4 years now. So it's become kind of more and more a part of my life. And it's just like one of the biggest things in my entire life right now.
Have you seen all the episodes? All 700 and something hours?
I absolutely have. I've seen everything. That includes the animated series and includes Discovery, all the movies, all the episodes, a lot of them multiple times. So yes, I've seen everything.
So you're currently rewatching TNG and you just finished Discovery rewatch. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I finished my first rewatch of Discovery. Loved it. I mean, I've loved Discovery, but I loved it even more this time, I think. Rewatching TNG, which is one of my absolute favorite series. I've been going through it a little bit more slowly recently because, podcasting commitments and other stuff in my life, but I'm making my way through. I'm almost done with season 5.
It's funny you bring that up because I'm a very disciplined rewatcher myself, meaning that I do not jump around. I sit down and I watch a season. I watch a whole series of Star Trek straight through, and it's not a matter of picking and choosing. So I go episode by episode, one by one. And having to rewatch episodes in preparation for the podcast, it throws me all out of order and I get all verklempt. and I have to remember, now, where are we exactly? And what are we talking about? What's happened at this point?
And I'm kind of doing a mix of that because I'm doing my rewatch, but I also, have a TNG podcast that I'm a co-host of. So each week there's certain things that we're picking out from different seasons or the movies. So then it's like, okay, yeah, where are we? Who's here, who's not, what's going on. So you have to kind of situate yourself. Whereas in episode by episode, oh, this happened last and then this. And I know we're in this season with these uniforms and stuff. So it's easier to keep track of. So
you're a disciplined rewatcher too, then?
I am, yeah. And I mean, I've done multiple rewatches like that of a lot of the series. And I mean, in fact, I think when I was first watching TNG, I watched it all the way through from the beginning. And then I watched it all the way through again before I went on to something else. So I do like to do a disciplined rewatch like that, even if it's something that I might not want to watch at the time, because there are some episodes that aren't so good.
Heresy.
But the truth.
Yeah. So tell me about your first Star Trek memory. What's the first interaction with Star Trek or that you can recollect in your life?
Yeah, so the first time I remember anything related to Star Trek in my life, it was when Star Trek 6 came out for the 25th anniversary. I was 12 years old at the time. I knew there was some kind of hullabaloo going on about Star Trek, and I went to see the movie with my dad, Star Trek 6. And I remember really enjoying it. But at the time, it was kind of like okay, that's another movie. When I was a kid, I'd see movies at the movie theater every week, sometimes twice a week. And it was just another one of those things. And it made a certain impression, but it was just something of that week. And then after that, a couple years later, I caught a season of Voyager when I was in high school. I think it was season 3. And that was actually pretty meaningful to me because it helped me to get me through a really difficult time in the last year of high school. But again, I kind of forgot about it. I remember there was a friend who was into DS9 in college and we watched an episode and I was like, okay, it's kind of interesting. And then, some years later, I met my wife who'd been a Star Trek fan for most of her life. And she'd seen, the reruns in the 70s and the motion picture in the theater. And I think all the other movies in the theaters, huge TNG fan. And I was trying to get into it. And I think one of the first things that we had watched was the motion picture. And I was like, this is boring. I'm really not into this. So I had some trouble getting into it. I know.
That's it. I'm putting your name on my whiteboard right now.
I love it a lot more now, but that was many years ago. But then an interesting thing happened, which is, it wasn't something I was thinking about. And then Star Trek 2009 came out. And I thought, okay, this will be something interesting to see if I'm really into this. I watched it. I loved it. And from there, I know a lot of people ask me like, oh, did you, go back to the original series after that? No, I went to the Next Generation because it was my wife's favorite. And I fell in love with the Next Generation. That was around 2009, 2010. Watched it all the way through. Watched it a second time. And then after that, I went on to DS9 and loved that. It's now my favorite series. And then I kind of went through gradually and rewatched things and watched everything in Star Trek. And in 2016, by then I'd watched everything and, I read lots of novels. And so it's been kind of this very gradual buildup over the last almost 27 years since Star Trek 6 came out. So I don't know if my story is unusual because I hear a lot of people say, oh, when I was a kid, I loved this and then that was it or whatever. But it kind of made little impressions and came in and out until it made somehow a huge impression with 2009. And ever since then, it's grown and grown and grown to where it's one of the biggest things in my life in this moment.
Well, I think that's an interesting story, Justin, because one of the things I want to do on this podcast is I want to talk to all different kinds of fans. So it's very interesting to me that you're really part of a generation that I think is a little different from some of the folks I've been talking to on the show in that you didn't necessarily grow up with it. I mean, of course, you exist in pop culture. We all do, right? We're all aware of these things that are out there, whether we're fans of them or not. But as far as being a real fan, it's something it seems like you came to more as a mostly grown adult. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, basically, I didn't really become a big fan until after I was 30. So, it is a bit of a different story. And actually, I know now that I've, read up on all this history in Star Trek that, for example, the Next Generation was a pretty huge thing. But I had, from what I remember, zero awareness that was going on or that it even existed, and it was on between when I was 8 and 14 or something like that. But just totally missed it. Didn't have any consciousness of it because I was into other stuff. So yeah, I definitely wasn't super into it when I was a kid, but as an adult, since I've been 30, it's been a huge thing.
One of the things that organically came up in previous episodes with some of the other guests has been how they consumed the show. And just another guest, which as you and I sit here recording this, you haven't heard this interview yet, but I had another guest on and we were talking about how when we were growing up, you had to watch the episode that was selected for you on broadcast. And it was sort of dribbled out, and you would get, even in a 26 season year of production of, say, TNG or Deep Space Nine, there were whole weeks when you didn't have any Star Trek to watch, new Star Trek anyway. And you were forced to have a diet, really, of Star Trek. And even when you're watching the episode, there were commercial breaks where you had to stop, and maybe let something sink in because you didn't have any other choice. Now, you're someone who experienced Discovery as it was coming out in first run. And it was, even though it was on a streaming service, we all know that it was still put out in a very broadcast TV way, right? One episode a week at a certain time. And yet it seems like your experience of TNG was probably on a binge, whether it was the DVDs or on a streaming service, whatever was available at the time. So talk to me about maybe the difference in how you consume those two shows and maybe how it affected your opinions of them in any way, if you can.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that I think because when I was coming into TNG and DS9, I think it was originally on DVDs and shortly after that streaming. I was able to go very quickly, episode by episode, sometimes multiple episodes in a day. And actually, I think that helped me to really love and appreciate it more. Because let me give an example. So after I watched TNG, I went on to watch DS9. That was in 2014, I think it was. And so I watched Emissary. I loved it. Thought, this is great. But then there's some, episodes in season 1 where it's like, not so good. I'm not sure if I'm into this. I was actually thinking of giving up on it, and my wife was like, no, keep going. It gets better. And I think because I was able to binge and maybe get past some of those things and really go through it quickly, it helped me to give it more of a chance and to love it more. Whereas if I was watching in the 90s week by week and I was like, oh, it had this great pilot, but it stumbled, forget about it. I might have had a different experience.
It's interesting that you say that, because I had the same experience with another show that's actually really popular right now, which was Westworld.
Mm-hmm.
People are talking about it. People are ranting about how fabulous it is. And I tell you, I didn't get halfway through the first episode. I said, I do not like this. It's not even interesting to me. It seems ponderous and I don't get it. And I turned it off, and, people are just like, nope, you must watch it. You must become part of the cult, I was like, dude, it's just not for me, And they're like, no, it gets better. And, like maybe, I don't know. That's the great thing about HBO, right? It's all on streaming, so I can catch up when I want to.
Yeah. I mean, and you asked about Discovery also, which was week by week. And like, I'm actually glad that it was week by week, because interestingly enough, because I was talking about binging like TNG and DS9 and loving it partly because of that. And I could kind of go through it quickly and kind of go past the bumps and all that quickly. But with something like Discovery, I feel like if they had just dropped it like, here's 15 episodes and have some fun and, you binge in a weekend or whatever, I think what can tend to happen is then it, that's the thing of the week, and then maybe it goes on for a couple of weeks and it gets forgotten or whatever, maybe except for a few shows. But because we were getting it week by week, there was this conversation we were having, this really in-depth conversation every week. I mean, I'm a host over on Trek FM, and we were having 5 shows a week about each Discovery episode, just from all of these different perspectives, which would have been impossible if you would have had it kind of all together. We would have had to talk about the thing as a whole. But being able to talk, I mean, it has its advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantage is you can really go into it in depth, digest it, kind of let it sit with you for a week before the next one. I think the disadvantage is it leads to all this like speculation and people thinking, oh, it means this or that, and they get consumed by that speculation until the next week. But I actually preferred that it was done week by week. I mean, also because like I don't tend to have like a huge amount of time to take a whole weekend to binge something. So if they would have dropped it that way, I would have been like, all right, I guess I'm off social media completely for like an entire week or two until I can watch this thing. Whereas if it's episode by episode, like, cool, I'll watch it for 45 minutes and then I'll go online and talk about it. So I kind of prefer that they did it that way. And I hope they do it that way for season 2, although they could certainly do it differently.
This is also something interesting you bring up. I want to come back to this in just a second. So I'm going to make a note here about it. Now, you talked about the fact that you married your wife and she had been a Star Trek fan from way back. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. From when she was a kid, yeah.
Okay. And, you were somewhat Star Trek familiar. Well, Justin, now you're like full on in the fandom. I mean, you're doing like all these podcasts. You're a guest on a Star Trek podcast about fans. You're reading novels. You're watching all the shows. You're doing social media. You, at some point, have probably surpassed wherever your wife is in your immersion into the fandom, or are you about the same, or how's that work?
No, I think that's true. Like in terms of like the interaction, like every day. I mean, she does still like watch a lot of Star Trek and think about a lot of Star Trek, interact with people online. But I'm just like, yeah, probably going at it a good bit more. And I spend a lot of time, especially on Twitter, just talking about, Star Trek during the day and at night, and doing the podcast on that and all of that. But yeah, I guess you could say that's true. Although I think it is still like a big part of her life and something that kind of guides how she thinks about things and her life. And in fact, she writes songs, and she's kind of been writing a Star Trek song, which is something I would probably never do because I don't have that talent. But yeah, I probably spend more time in it every day. But I think it is every bit as meaningful to her as it is to me.
Then my question, though, is at some point, does she ever say to you, I think I've created a monster?
No, no. I mean, I think she thinks it's really great because it's something that's been meaningful to her for a long time, and now I can really see like how important it is and the meaning in it. So, but do I sometimes talk about Star Trek? Maybe a little much, maybe, but no, I don't think it's that kind of thing where it's like I can't believe that you're so consumed by this. I don't think it's like that.
It's interesting because just speaking for myself, I have the exact opposite experience. My wife does not do any sort of science fiction or fantasy whatsoever. Mm. And I'll tell her, oh, I did this amazing thing happened on my podcast. We were talking about this episode. And she's like, you're going to have to translate all of this into words that I speak. And then I have to start, well, okay. So the Enterprise is on this mission and it's a spaceship and it's in space and it's going to this other place and they're not part of the thing, and it's like I have to start, right from the beginning, right? First they were the dinosaurs, then they made oil, and Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like, and I can talk with my wife about that and say like, oh, we were talking about, such and such episode and this, and we'll start talking about it for a while and she'll know exactly what that is because she's seen it and all that. So, yeah. Oh, sorry, you don't have that experience.
No, it's very interesting. But this is my outlet, is doing this podcast. So that's this is my outlet for getting my Trek on, this and STLV. I want to go back to something you talked about as far as Discovery coming out on a weekly basis and you being so involved in the fandom over at the wonderful and amazing folks at Trek FM, who I have the highest respect for the work that you guys do. Tell me a little bit about how you feel or what your thoughts are around the level of analysis that each and every Discovery episode got as it was coming out. Because it seemed to me, and this is something that I think is interesting because in the age of social media, this is the first Star Trek we've had, separate from the movies, where it's coming out in this kind of era where each episode is getting a lot of analysis. How did you feel about that as a fan and having that happen sort of, being right in the middle of it as it's happening?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of aspects to it. The first thing is, like, no matter what reaction somebody has, positive, negative, in the middle, they're talking about it. I mean, it's clear that it wasn't like Discovery dropped and nobody even cared and nobody wanted to talk about it. Like, I think even, when people might have like a negative opinion or hate it, they're noticing it, they're talking about it. It's because there's something they're passionate about in Star Trek that gets them to do that. So it gets the conversation going. And like I think there's this analysis that a company called Parrot Analytics does of kind of the overall like reach of a show. And for Discovery, in a lot of the weeks that it aired, it was, number 1 or number 2 in that ranking against things like, Game of Thrones and stuff like that. So there's lots and lots of conversation going on. And I think that's a good thing. The worst thing is if it was completely ignored and nobody cared. The other thing is that you see the complete spectrum. Like you see the people that really love it, and I was one of them. And you see the people that really hate it, people that have questions. And like over on Trek FM, it was interesting because Amy Nelson, who you've had on before, has this show called Postcards from the Edge, where we ask listeners like, what was your feedback? And we get hundreds of comments, and it just totally runs the gamut from people who have questions, people who love it, people who hate it. So it's kind of all over. But as far as the level of analysis, I think that it can be good to a point. But I think what I've seen is it can get to a certain point where all that's being talked about is like the nitpicking and, missing kind of the bigger picture. That kind of bothers me a little bit, but people are entitled to their opinion. And I've definitely seen people that are new to Star Trek coming into it because of Discovery. And that's always a good thing. So it's getting the conversation going. And, just about every Star Trek series after the original series had some component of fans that were really against it. There were people who thought that it was heresy to have something like The Next Generation, and now it's pretty much completely beloved. So those things change over time too. But I think it's like overall, when I look at it, it's great that it's being talked about, that people are talking about Star Trek, and it's not, dying because it's being ignored, right?
Well, I'd agree with you that I think it's great that people are talking about it. And I enjoyed being involved in the fandom and talking to people about it. But let me put the question more directly to you in another way, Justin. And I'll use myself as an example, which I hate to do on the podcast. Well, actually, I do it a lot, and that's probably why I hate doing it so much. But I'll use myself as an example. I felt like being involved online in social media with a lot of other fans, in a way, it spoiled Discovery in some ways. And this is not a criticism of Discovery in any way, but I think that every possible twist and turn, every possible everything had already been analyzed and seen in advance. And I felt like being so involved in the social media and with listening to as many podcasts as I was during the show's airing, that everything was already spoiled for me in a lot of ways. Did you have a different experience?
I'm going to disagree with you on that, because I think, like, if you take certain examples, like, the Vogue Tyler reveal, sure, that was spoiled. But there were other things. There were. I was keeping up with everything, and there were certain things that actually people didn't anticipate. Like, for example, Colbert's death. I don't think I heard anybody the week before being like, "Yep, this is the week Colbert's going to die. It's coming." So I think there were certain things like that, and also I was completely taken by surprise that Takuvma died at the end of the second episode, because I thought he was going to be kind of the ongoing foil or villain. So I'll just disagree with everything being spoiled. I think there are certain things that were spoiled, or where there were good. A lot of people thought, oh, this is going to happen. Lorca's from the mirror universe, that kind of thing. But the way that, and I'm kind of two minds, like, oh, I don't want to be spoiled, but I also love having the interaction and seeing what people are thinking and theorizing and speculating about things. And even if you know something's going to happen, an example that I'll use is the Vogue Tyler reveal. Like, you knew that was going to happen by a certain point, but the way that it happens and those scenes that you see between Burnham and Tyler are, I think, incredible. Like, the way that they, even if you knew it was coming, the way that they executed it had an incredible power, even if you knew it was coming. And I think that's the mark of a really great show. So I don't think that it really took, at least from my perspective, took away any enjoyment. And I really thoroughly enjoyed, interacting with people and seeing what they were thinking and speculating, actually.
So you remind me of a quote that a showrunner from another show once put out. No, I'm serious. He, without getting into what show it was, because it really doesn't matter, but he was responding to a fan who said, well, we saw this coming, right, in this particular show. And his response was, here's a story for you. Boy meets girl, boy loves girl, boy loses girl, boy dies. That's Romeo and Juliet. That's also King Kong. It's all in the execution, right, of what actually happens. So just knowing that something will even happen doesn't tell you a lot. So I get what you're saying, and I can appreciate it. I felt like with the level of analysis that Discovery is getting, especially if you're consuming all the podcasts and doing all the real-time stuff while it's happening, which, again, I love doing too. I wonder in a way how that affects the experience, because it's so different for a Star Trek series, right? We've never had this before, even back in the era of Enterprise, unless you were getting on CompuServe or something, or Prodigy back in the day.
I can see that, although there was even way back when people would have, these Star Trek fan publications where they'd write letters constantly back and forth about different things, not necessarily as it was airing, but there was still, I think, a lot of conversation going on, but it was different, and you couldn't do it quite right in the moment. So I can see how that changes things, but I think and I totally understand. I mean, I think the perspective that you're giving is completely valid. I just feel like it's worth it for the interaction that I get, and I've tended to follow a lot of people who love Discovery and are positive about it, so I see a lot more of that. So maybe what I'm seeing might be a little bit different, but I've just enjoyed it and loved interacting with people about it, and actually look forward to doing it again for the next season.
I have a Twitter selection that I've compiled of the people who are basically unhinged about Discovery. And while I don't include them in my main feed, every once in a while I go over there and kind of see what kind of stuff they're talking about, to see what they're latching onto. And
choosing your pain, some of it huh?
Well, I think it is one of the conceits of the show is that Star Trek fans come in many different varieties. And so I feel like if I'm going to be a somewhat neutral arbiter and host on the show, I need to know what people are saying, even people that I may not agree with.
Okay.
And so I think it's important to know what their perspective is on it. But it's always interesting to see those different kinds of takes. So I would encourage all fans out there, go see what other kinds of fans are saying, as long as they're being respectful, right? That's important, right? If they're completely disrespectful, that's a different issue entirely. But I think it's important to look at all the different perspectives for sure. let me move on and talk about a couple of other things. How do you watch Star Trek? On a small device, on a big device, on headphones, in a big home theater? How are you consuming it?
Yeah, I'm mostly watching it on our smart TV. It's 48 inches or something like that. Not gigantic, but not small. So that's how I'm mostly watching it. And, oftentimes watch it on, I work from home, so I watch it on like a lunch break or, on the weekend or in the evening or something like that. So there have been times where I've watched it or had to watch it on a smaller device, but I definitely prefer fairly large size TV to watch it on. I think that's the best way to do it.
Nice. And are you a collector?
I am of certain things, and I just say of certain things because I have, I think, limited space to collect, and I don't like to move a lot of stuff around from place to place that I go. I do have some ships. I think in the shelf behind me, I have 11 different ships from different series and eras. That may be the extent of my collection for a while because I don't necessarily have a place to have lots of ships because I know Eagle Moss has put out like hundreds of them. I also, and I'll say to an extent, collect the novels. I've read lots of novels, but I don't actually have most of them on my shelf because I don't, taking up that shelf space. So after I read them, I'll often donate them to a thrift store so someone else can read them. But I do have like a shelf of ones that are waiting to be read. There's probably about 30 or 40 down there. And I do prefer physical books because I'll read an ebook if I have to, but it's like on my job, I work on looking at a screen every day, and just like even the experience of just like holding your phone to or just looking at your phone and staring at it to see an ebook, I don't necessarily like that. So I prefer getting the physical books, but I solve the kind of shelf space issue by donating them as I read them for the most part. So yeah, I collect some things, but it's a small collection. I have some posters and things, but definitely not the biggest Star Trek collection of stuff that you'll find. Any
costumes or cosplay?
No, yeah, it's nothing that I've done. I think that I'm going to STLV this year, and the extent of my cosplay is probably wearing a disco shirt. It was seen on screen, so it counts. But I don't know. It's kind of like I really admire and love the cosplay that people do, but it's kind of like the effort and like the comfort level and getting attention for that, and so I've just kind of like thought about it, but I haven't done it. But I'll wear my disco shirt. That'll be my cosplay.
I'll tell you a true thing. I did a pretty elaborate cosplay last year, and it was my most comfortable day of the year.
Really?
Well, not that. That's not true. It was my most comfortable day at the con.
At the con, what did you cosplay as?
For every day of the con, I had a uniform I would wear, and I have the boots, which I carefully researched to get the accurate boots. They're uncomfortable as hell. I hate wearing them. I have to sit down all the time in them, and that's for a regular first contact area uniform I have.
Okay.
So, that's boring, but, it's the correct boots. I hate wearing it. It's uncomfortable. The Anovos uniform pants are high-waisted, so you wear them kind of around your gut. They're uncomfortable to sit down on. It's very uncomfortable. But I came up with my own cosplay for Saturday, which is the big cosplay day. I was a follower of Lokai from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield.
Okay. I think I may have seen that picture of you.
Oh, in the black and white checkered suit, which was very comfortable to wear. I have black and white checkered Vans, very comfortable to wear. And, it was like the easiest day, and so while I had to worry about makeup and stuff, I wasn't carrying anything. I didn't have any heavy kit on, and the shoes were comfortable. The suit was comfortable. Everything was very comfortable. Nice. Whereas wearing the uniforms was way more uncomfortable.
I could see that. Yeah. And it may be
this year I might. Go ahead.
I was going to say, cosplaying may be something that I do somewhere in the future, but I find that I'm just like too lazy about the prep. It's like I'm t-shirt and jeans pretty much every day. So going outside of that can be an effort.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that you're going to STLV this year. Mm-hmm. Is this your first, or is this, are you coming back?
Last year was my first, so coming back for a second year.
Why? But you've already been. So why come back again? You've already seen it. You've already done it. What's in it for you?
Well, a couple of things. I think a lot of people talk about this. It's great to see the people there. There's just, and also to be in the atmosphere where there's thousands of people that are big Star Trek fans too. It's an opportunity to meet people. There's a lot of people from Trek FM, hosts and listeners that'll be going. So it's a great place to actually see people instead of just interacting online or through a podcast. I also, enjoy the panels, and there are only certain ones that I could go to because there's so many that are going on at the same time. So there are other ones that I'll probably want to see. There are some people that weren't there, guests that weren't there last week, not last week, last year, like Jason Isaacs that I definitely want to see. But I think a lot of it is just being in that atmosphere where it's like, this is the time for Star Trek for thousands of people. I think the only other con that I've really gone to is there's a Comic-Con here in El Paso that I went to a couple of months ago, and that was cool. But like the Star Trek presence, there was a TNG panel with people like Jonathan Frakes and Marina Sirtis, which was cool. I got to see them, but outside of that, it was all this. And I may be like a weird sci-fi fan, but it's pretty much like at least at this time in my life, my sci-fi fandom starts and ends with Star Trek. So when I'm at something that's more than Star Trek, it's just like I'm not into all this other stuff. So I got kind of a little bored with the rest of it. So having something that's like wall-to-wall Star Trek is great, and I can just be totally into everything that's there.
I think what you bring up, Justin, is a very accurate and very typical explanation for a lot of people that I've talked to anyway, where the first time, it's a lot about going to see the talent, the actors, and doing all the convention things. But then it turns into this whole nother thing once you start making connections with the people and the fans. And STLV turns into a very different experience when you're seeing a bunch of different people and you're doing all those things, for sure. A little bit of advice for anybody who's coming back. I think you're going to find that the more you come back, the more you're going to find it's almost impossible to manage your schedule. I mean, as we record this, you and I, Justin, STLV is a few weeks away, and I've already found myself triple booked twice.
Oh, wow.
So it gets to be a little crazy. Yeah, it gets to be crazy. So, yeah, but it's all right. It's part of the fun. Okay. So is there anything else we should talk about as far as you as a fan, the way that you watch it, the way that you consume it, the way that you enjoy it?
Well, we touched on it a little bit, but one of the things that I'm very much into like all the time is the novels. So for me, the way that I feel about it is like I've seen everything on screen in Star Trek, but there's this whole other universe of Star Trek stories in the novels, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them. So actually, I first got into the novels after I'd first watched DS9, and I was like, wait a minute, there's got to be more. And then I found the relaunch novel starting with the Avatar 2 book series, and I love that. And ever since then, just about every week, I'm reading a Star Trek novel. I also post reviews on some different Facebook groups, which are for like Star Trek novels and comics. Guested on a couple of podcasts talking about the novels. So that's actually a big way in every day. I'm actually spending more time at this point reading novels than rewatching episodes. That's become like a big way to really like immerse myself in kind of this expanded universe. So that's a huge part of my fandom at this point. I've read 170 novels at this point, and I still have, 600 to go. So it's a long-term project. Wow. But I'm committed to reading every single one of them, even if it takes me, the next 10 or 20 years.
So let's interrogate this then a little bit, because one of the things that I talked about in another podcast, it might have been my own podcast, I can't even remember at this point, but I read some of these discovery novels and the big ones that are very closely tied in, and it made it, I think, a little bit difficult for me to analyze the show solely as the show because I kept being informed by what I'd read in the novels. So my question for you is, are you getting your head canon, if you know that term, confused with what you're seeing in the screen? And do you have any trouble sort of separating in your head between things you read and things you saw? Because there's so much Star Trek content out there, it has to get all muddled together in some way.
By and large, I haven't had an issue with that. I mean, and in fact, like one of the things that happens though is like I'll read a novel that's supposed to, let's say, take place during a certain period of time, or even novelizations that are about certain episodes or movies. And it'll inform a little bit how I think about those, but I don't actually find myself getting confused between what I've seen on screen and what I've read in a novel. What happens more often is I'll see something on screen and I'll be like, wait a minute, was there a follow-up in a novel? I don't even remember which one. So I'll get confused with whether I've read something else about it. But like I've read all of the Discovery novels. There's just 3 at this point, and I don't know. I personally haven't had that issue where I'm getting kind of things mixed up. And even if I was, that would be fine because like the way that I feel about it is if there wasn't this expanded universe of novels, then I would have seen everything, and there would be there's lots and lots to rewatch and analyze. But I'm always excited that there's a new story, and I don't know how it's going to turn out or how it might actually inform how I next rewatch an episode or a movie.
Very good. I'm just going to ask you a couple potpourri questions here before we move on. Why is the Romulan commander one of your favorite guest characters on Star Trek from the Enterprise incident TOS?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Enterprise incident is one of my all-time favorite episodes. I had a chance to rewatch it recently, and I don't know, there's just something about it. Season 3 of TOS gets maligned quite a bit, even though there is some good stuff in there. But like, there's just something about that episode from start to finish that is just so well done and so well written. And we learn so much more about the Romulans there than you really do in Balance of Terror. And so the female Romulan commander, I find her to be this really fascinating character. And actually, she's kind of in a position that I think in the original series, you don't really see someone in Starfleet in. She's commanding a ship. She's effectively the captain of that ship. And just like seeing during the episode, I think she's a really well-rounded character. And I think she's very strong and compelling. And I think also helped to influence kind of what you see later in The Next Generation, where you do see a lot of female commanders on the Romulan side. And I don't know, it's just, whenever I see that episode, I just find it's even hard to put into words. She's such a compelling and interesting character, and I want to know so much more, but she's just in that one episode.
I'm very certain that it's explicitly stated in some TOS episode, not that one, that women can't command starships.
Oh, I think that you're thinking about Turnabout Intruder, which is an episode that I want to forget about.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But the reason I bring it up is because, hey, the Romulans are way ahead on gender equity compared to where the Federation is.
At least according to that episode, which I think subsequent iterations of Star Trek have just kind of ignored. Otherwise, I don't think there would be any female captains on Discovery. But it is very, very interesting. They're saying that the Romulans were kind of ahead of the curve, and also in that portrayal, I think they were like ahead of the curve of where things were in TV portrayals as well, for women to have that much power and influence on a ship.
What's interesting to me is that the actress's child actually appeared in an episode that we're going to, as a guest star in an episode that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So that's a nice tie-in for you. So stand by for that.
Okay.
Let me ask you about some other characters. Your favorite regular character, Major Kira. Tell me about her. Why is she one of your favorites?
She's really my all-time favorite Star Trek character, and for a couple of reasons. So I see her as someone from the very beginning. She's fiercely independent. You really don't want to mess with her. And she's a very strong character. But at the same time, like during the course of DS9, you do see the sides of her that are spiritual, that can have love and compassion. And I think that like she's a really strong character, but she has strengths in all of kind of these different areas. It's not just like, she can fight and she can be fierce and tough. And she was part of the Bajoran resistance before that. And I absolutely love the arc that she has, where she's been a resistance fighter, I think, since she was a teenager, and has this really strong dislike, probably hate of the Cardassians at the beginning of the show. But that starts to kind of break a little bit in an episode like Duet, where it's not enough that someone's a Cardassian for them to be punished or to die. And then going all the way to the end of the show, where she is actually flipping it on its head, and she is helping a Cardassian resistance against the Dominion, I think is amazing. I mean, I think she's like a really inspirational character that's been through so much, but that can still kind of live her life through all of these different sides, is someone that is a great fighter, but at the same time has this spiritual side to her and this side that can express love. And I don't know, there's just something about the character that I've always connected with. And, in seeing everything in Star Trek, she's just my absolute favorite character and may always be the case.
So I'm going to indulge myself here for just a second. I want to ask you about one element of Major Kira. And the only reason I asked this is because I got pretty well blasted in social media for talking about this. I really enjoyed her relationship with Vedek Bareil, and I was sad that they killed him off. And I had posted in a couple places that I thought it was really interesting how this somewhat militant, somewhat tough not somewhat, but a tough lady character, very hardcore. She goes with this guy who's got very deep, sort of serene spirituality. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it was a very interesting match. And I was quite taken with it. And I thought they were great for each other. And I really enjoyed it. And I was told in no uncertain terms that was not the correct interpretation. So I got beat up pretty bad for that. But I'd be curious for your take.
Well, I'll just take a page from Jim Morehouse, Enterprise Extra. No wrong answers. Here's how I feel about it. So, I think when I first watched it, I liked Bareil and I liked their relationship. As I've watched it subsequently, I still like their relationship, but I feel like Bareil was kind of underutilized and came across, I think, as maybe a bit too flat. I like their relationship, but I found myself caring the most for Bareil in the scene where he's basically dying and Kira starts, I think, telling him a little bit of a story of their relationship. That makes me cry. I think it's beautiful, but he's kind of lying there unconscious. And that's when I'm feeling for him the most. I like their relationship, but in rewatching it, I wish he had a few more notes to him. He felt pretty much like just a certain note. He's the serene Vedic and he has wisdom, and I love that. But I felt like maybe it was a little too underplayed.
I could see that. But the example that I bring up is when we were talking about that particular episode where he's, dying, someone said the only reason to watch that episode is to make sure that Bareil is really dead. And
that's
I thought,
cruel,
wow, okay.
Man. That's cruel.
Yeah. So, I liked it. Some people didn't. That's okay. I'll take my lumps on it, but I like what I like.
I appreciate what you're saying.
If you disagree,
and I like it. I just wish there was maybe a bit more to it or to his character.
I get you. And if the tens of listeners out there, you have an opinion on it, come at me on the Twitter and we can hash it out, and then we'll hug it out after. All right. So since we're talking about episodes, let's go ahead and jump into some episodes. So Justin, as always, I had the M5 prepare a list of what it thinks you think are the best episodes and the most meaningful episodes of Star Trek. And since we were talking about episodes, I think this might be a good time to move into that part of the conversation. I think we can probably start with best episodes. And let's start with In the Pale Moonlight, an episode that certainly has come up more than a few times on this podcast. Please tell me why you think it is one of the best episodes of all Star Trek. Out of all 700 and something hours, why is this one elevated above all the others?
Yeah, I would argue it's the best episode in all of Star Trek, all of the 700 plus hours. I think for a couple of reasons. So first of all, the way that it's structured with Sisko telling this story in his quarters and the log entry, I think, is done brilliantly. And the way that it kind of proceeds through each of the things that Sisko goes through, and the acting that Avery Brooks has and Andrew Robinson as Garak is amazing. But one of the reasons it stands out, and it's interesting because Sisko does all of these things. He says at the end, I lied, I cheated, I was an accessory to murder, I bribed people to do this and that. In a lot of other shows and something out of Star Trek, it would be yeah, maybe that's a typical episode. But in Star Trek, it's totally shocking that he's doing that and he's getting away with it. So I think it's the best episode because, I think it's brilliantly executed in how it's done. But also, during the course of the episode, you're kind of seeing Sisko examine his conscience and his soul to see, was what he had done worth it? And I think at the end of it, and I think it could be open to interpretations because I've seen different people take it different ways. I think at the end of it, he feels he was trying really hard to convince himself it was worth it doing this, but he's like, was it? I'm really not sure. And there's a certain ambiguity to that, and putting yourself into that position to see what would I have done in that kind of situation? And also he's doing these things that you really don't see anyone else in Star Trek do and get away with. And it's kind of the critical component to bring the Romulans into the war and to win the Dominion War. Also, I think it's kind of a brilliant way to resolve something that I think was an issue up to that point, which is the Dominion has, I think, a pretty good numerical advantage, and it looks like they're going to grind the Federation down to nothing if there isn't some kind of intervention, and this is the intervention that they need. So I don't know. I think it's just such a well executed episode and very thought provoking. And in the context of Star Trek, it's it's like a bomb going off. It's like this is something that you never thought you would see in Star Trek, and I love it for that.
Let me pause here and ask you a different question. And I'm going to come back to these episodes in a minute, but I think it's worth it to interrogate this a little bit more deeply. Justin, what do you think Star Trek is?
Yeah, so I for me, Star Trek is a couple of things. So it is about a better future, a more hopeful future, a future that's unlike the present, where you're just kind of saturated with things every day about war and violence and poverty and disease and all of these things that are just heartbreaking to see. In this future, at least, on Earth or in the Federation or to a certain extent, those things are conquered, and we can focus on really bettering ourselves. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think Star Trek is, it's about diversity. I mean, from the original series, it was about the diversity of people from different parts of the Earth and aliens like Spock. And I think that's just kind of grown and grown in the different series, where it's really about different types of people working together. And I mean, like, if you think about all of the differences and all of the divisions we have here on Earth, and we're all part of the same species, right? But Star Trek is giving this vision where even between all of these different kinds of species who are so much different, than any two people on Earth are different, and they're able to work together and get along in the Federation and have to solve different problems, I think is incredibly inspiring. And I think it's one of the reasons why Star Trek is such a big part of my life, because it's like I want to be a part of that future, because it just breaks my heart every day. These things that happen where people are dying or their violence because we have all of these differences and we're all part of the same species. We may look different or sound different or act different or whatever, but we are so much more similar than, any two species in Star Trek ever would be. So I think it's just inspirational to work toward that. To a certain extent, like it's a utopian ideal, but if we could at least work toward that and try to get, closer and closer to that, I think things would be a lot better. And that's really what it's about for me, the better future, and really diversity making us better and stronger and not worse.
Justin, that's a beautiful answer, and I would agree with pretty much everything you said. And I've talked about what I think Star Trek is on the show before, and I have always summed it up in my own way of thinking, is that it's us solving our problems and building a better future. So I just want to ask you this question, not because I'm trying to make things difficult or challenge you just for challenging's sake, but I want you to reconcile a couple things for me. Mm-hmm. So you talked about solving our problems and becoming better people, yet you've picked an episode where the person who is supposed to exemplify the paragon of Starfleet and Federation virtues is a liar and a cheater. Mm-hmm. And your two favorite characters, both regular character and non-human character, are both non-humans, right? Well, wait, that doesn't make sense. But I asked you your favorite character was. You picked a non-human
yes.
for that. And you picked a non-Federation person for favorite alien. So just reconcile this for me, because it seems like I'm having a hard time keeping both thoughts in my head at the same time about where you're going with this.
Sure. And this is something that I've thought about a little bit. Like, I'm so inspired by the vision of a better future, and yet my favorite series is Deep Space Nine, which definitely seems on the surface to challenge that. Here's what I would say to that. So what's happening at Deep Space Nine and what's happening in the episode In the Pale Moonlight is something that's happening outside of the Federation, but it is something that is happening, I would say, overall in defense of those ideals. So I think a lot of what you see in TNG and that I love is that there are people that are, on Federation ships, well, in that case, the Enterprise D in the show, and they're kind of these beacons of the Federation, but they're dealing within those certain confines, right? But there has to be someone out there, like on the fringes, who's helping to defend that. And I think one of the reasons why Deep Space Nine is my favorite series, and I think In the Pale Moonlight is the best episode, is that it asks the question, how far are you willing to go in order to defend those ideals? What are the things that are right and wrong in that pursuit? Is it by its nature that when you're outside of those confines, outside of the Federation, like Deep Space Nine is, that you need to do certain things that you might not normally do, or certain compromises, so that you can defend those ideals within the Federation and on Earth. I mean, it's kind of like what Sisko says in one episode. It's easy to be a saint in paradise, right? That there are these people in the Federation that are living in this paradise, but how did it get to that point? As far as we know from Star Trek's history, it got to that point because there was World War III, lots of things got obliterated, and an alien species, the Vulcans, came to basically help us after the first warp flight. So why I love Deep Space Nine and In the Pale Moonlight is because it's asking those questions of how far would you go? What is necessary in order to defend those ideals? And I see Deep Space Nine as one large defense of those ideals, and trying to kind of interrogate and think about the methods that are correct for doing that. And I think that can inform discussions that we have today about what is the best way to do something. Now, like I couldn't imagine myself doing the kinds of things that Sisko does, or even being put into that position. But I think it's important that we ask that question and see how we get there, instead of just thinking it's, kind of a magic wand or a magic way of doing it. I hope that makes sense, because that's kind of how I think about it.
Your Section 31 recruitment packet is in the mail as we speak.
Yeah.
All right, moving on along.
I'm not saying that I would. Let me just be clear. I'm not saying that I would want to do those things. In fact, I could never imagine myself doing those things. But we have to ask those questions. How far should we go, and what should we do in order to get to something that's better? And I think it's very relevant for where we are now, where we have lots of problems and a long way to go before we get there. What are the best methods? And it helps to ask those questions, which I think, for the most part, you're not asking in a series like The Next Generation. It's kind of taken as a given that that's how you do things.
No, right. I get it. I was just giving you a little bit of grief there, but in all seriousness, I think that the way that it starts is it starts small. And if you want some examples, just ripped from the somewhat recent headlines, you look at a guy like Bernie Madoff, right? The guy who perpetrated that big fraud on Wall Street. Mm-hmm. He didn't say, well, I'm going to start a business, a hedge fund or an investment fund, and I'm going to be a crook. He started with the best of intentions. He wanted to do the right thing, and he made a compromise, mm-hmm. a small one at one point, to try to make a quarter look right. And then he discovered that, people started giving him more money, and then the whole thing just spiraled out of control, and he ended up holding a tiger by the tail. And I'm not trying to excuse it in any way, but I'm trying to say that, it does start small and it tends to get big. Another example, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, I have talked about it on the podcast before, is the story of this company called Theranos. Have you seen this one in the news?
I don't think I have.
So I'm not going to go into the whole story here, but essentially this young woman drops out of Stanford, at 19 years old, and she wants to start a company. And her vision is that she wants to replace venous blood draws. When you go to the doctor and she says, go get your labs done, and you go to the lab and they take mm-hmm. 3 or 4 vials out of you. She wants to do all the same tests with a finger prick, like those little glucose monitors mm-hmm. That the diabetics use, to monitor their sugar. Yeah. And, which would be great, right? I mean, my God, who wouldn't want that? And she started with the best of intentions, and she started this company, and her company was worth about $9 billion at one point. Or that might have been her personal wealth. I can't remember now. But the fact is that she had very serious investment, very serious people involved in her company. She had lots of people that were working for her. And it was all a scam. She realized very soon that the whole thing wasn't going to work. And she just kept right on making up stuff. Mm-hmm. And people got their medical tests were invalidated. People got medical scares based on the results of the equipment that her company had made. I mean, it was just a terrifying story. Mm. But it began by making a small compromise, and then it just spiraled out of control. And, I would encourage people to go read the news stories if you want. There's lots of information about this, but I think that's how it happens. And so when I see things like in the Pale Moonlight, it makes me very nervous, because I think, where could this go? Because, you start small and then these things tend to spiral.
And seeing that makes me very nervous as well, because I think like those are the wrong methods. But I think the way that the episode's written, that's the way that he has to go about it. But I think also we need to think about the incentives. Like in our current society, and those examples that you're giving, the incentive is to make money, right? But if you look at what the incentive is for what Sisko's doing in the Pale Moonlight, It's not anything like that. His incentive is to make sure that the Federation and its ideals don't get destroyed, right? That doesn't mean that the methods that he uses are necessarily the correct ones or the most moral ones for a particular situation, but he is motivated by something, I think, quite different, which may lead to some different outcomes and different ways of thinking of things. Not to excuse it, but I think it is interesting just to make the contrast of what he's looking to accomplish versus what someone, who's trying to make a lot of money at a company is looking to accomplish, and they make small compromises in order to do that.
Well, I will say this, as far as the Theranos story goes, I think Elizabeth Holmes, was in some ways driven by money, but a bigger issue in my analysis of the news story, and this is just for, people who are listening to this, is that I think that she herself and people in Silicon Valley were desperate in the strongest possible way to support a female entrepreneur who looked like she was going to be right up there with Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs and, all these other quote unquote luminaries of Silicon Valley, whatever you think of them. And I think that's how she got over on a lot of people, is that they just so desperately wanted her to succeed because they wanted a diversity message that they ignored their own warning signs about what was happening. And I think that's very clear in the news reporting about what had happened and some of the examples that are brought up in the case. And it's just, and I could see that people were coming from a good place, which is, I get that. It's a good thing that people wanted, but they let that color their perception of what was actually happening. And a lot of people's lives got destroyed because of it, because of other people's good intentions.
Sure.
And it's amazing the blinders we can put on ourselves because of these things. Anyway, I don't want to go too far. We're going pretty far afield here. Let's move on. Yeah. I'm sure I'm boring people with this, but let's briefly talk about The Measure of a Man, because we got some other episodes to talk about, which I think will be great. So, but Measure of a Man is a pretty big classic, especially for TNG. So tell me about this one.
I love the episode because it's one of those episodes in Star Trek where there are no fights, there's no battles. A lot of it is just people talking to each other, and there's this kind of court hearing that you see. And what I love about it is that it's taking a look at someone who is kind of different from the other people you see on the show. Data's an android. He's not, an organic being like you see elsewhere. And it's about what are his rights. And I think it's so wonderful that they took the time in this so well done episode to really talk about that. And I feel like, if we get to the point where we do have androids that are kind of Data's capabilities, or they can kind of act like humans and kind of live their own independent lives, I feel like this is the kind of episode that people need to see in order to kind of sort out those questions. And I think that one of the interesting things about the episode is I think that Whoopi Goldberg as Guinan was just kind of available at the last minute, and they had to write it in. And there's that scene that she's in where Picard is realizing, like, oh my goodness, what we're talking about is slavery, and like we'd be making this race of androids that would be subservient to other people. And it's kind of like this really key insight into the episode that kind of happened at the last minute. But I just love that we're talking about, someone's rights and taking the time to really establish that. And I think it's just beautiful because, like, from the first time I saw, TNG season 1, episode 1, Encounter at Farpoint, I could tell that Data was kind of a special person and should be treated equally like everyone else was. And it's just wonderful that that's established here.
One of the things you mentioned that I think is important to point out is that you're right. It is just an episode with a bunch of people in a room talking. And especially for the non-science fiction fans, they always think that science fiction is about ships and pew, pew, pew and bombs and weapons and, space aliens and all that stuff. And some of the very best episodes have nothing to do with that. Yeah. It's just people in a room talking. And one of the things that always makes a good episode for me isn't just good acting, which is always important, right? You have to have that for any episode of any kind. But when you really give actors the opportunity to do quality scenes with each other, where they get to react in a longer scene, where they have to emote and respond and be in the moment. This is certainly an example of that. This episode, and there's lots of other episodes like this. One of my all-time favorite examples of this comes from another show. And I don't know if you ever saw Babylon 5, but there's an episode in that called Intersections in Real Time. And the whole thing is two guys in a room talking. That's it. That's the whole episode. And each scene is filmed in real time. So, each 15-minute conversation is a 15-minute conversation straight through with just, the two guys talking. And it was all done in one take. And it's great when you could just get the actors to really act with each other. It makes something really beautiful and special. So I think the episode should certainly be appreciated just on that level, just because we like to see the actors spread their wings too. So I'd agree with you. One episode that hasn't come up on the podcast before, though, and I want to spend a minute talking about it, and possibly a couple, is Living Witness. So for those who may not remember, this is the Voyager episode where Voyager really isn't even in it, except in a flashback. And it takes place on a planet in the Delta Quadrant where the Voyager passed by 700 years earlier. Yeah, and they wake up a backup program of the Doctor to talk about what had happened. So tell me why you think this is one of the best episodes of all Star Trek.
I absolutely love this episode. I actually hadn't seen it until a couple of years ago, and it just completely astounded me by its ambition and the themes that it was talking about. Probably Living Witness, maybe in my top 2 or 3 in all of Star Trek. Because, so first of all, it's a very ambitious episode because it's not really like it's toward the, I think it's toward the end of season 4, but it's just kind of dropped in there. You don't quite know what's happening. It's 700 years after Voyager has passed. I think it's probably close to the furthest in the future we've ever seen. And there's this backup module of the Doctor. And I love a couple of things about it. It talks about the impact that Voyager is going to be having probably throughout a lot of the Delta Quadrant, which they don't really talk about much within the series itself. They had this visit, things happened, they went on. I mean, there were dozens of episodes like that in Voyager. And it talks about what can happen with revisionist history, which I think is a topic that you don't get to see too much about in Star Trek, because they've taken these partial schematics or this information that Voyager left behind, and they're constructing these things. And what you get is probably the closest to a Voyager Mirror Universe episode that you will ever see, because they're just, ruthless and even like Harry is interrogating people and beating them up. I mean, it's just, and it makes you think also like, okay, how much do we really know about what happened 700 years ago or 7,000 years ago? We're making all of these assumptions based on partial information from what may have happened in the past that we don't really necessarily know exactly what happened that length of time before. And I think that like just going through that exercise to see how things can get distorted, and also this impact that Voyager is going to have for a long time to come. I mean, it just points up like you can't just assume like, it's no big deal, but they've changed things throughout a lot of the Delta Quadrant. And it also has, I think, some really great discussions about racism and about these things that can happen where groups of people can put together certain narratives about the way things can happen, and power can kind of go back and forth. And there's all of these important stories about what happened. I think there's just like a lot of really great discussion and themes. And a lot of it is just discussion. They're just discussing this history and what happened. And I also love that, at the end of the episode, it puts you a little further into the future. You don't know how far. It could be 10 years or 700 years, where, the Doctor this backup module has made this positive impact to help correct things. And there's no reset. Like, it's saying this is what happens in the future. This is how it will be. I don't know. There's just something about it that I love and that just blows me away with like the discussion of these different themes and the long-term impact that even like a brief visit like Voyager has to this planet can have.
It is interesting the way you bring it up, because as you were talking, I was thinking of another Star Trek episode. I was thinking of a piece of the action, actually. Which is in that episode, right? We see sort of both sides of it. We see how the Ioshan culture adapted this book that was left behind by that earlier Starship visit. Mm-hmm. And then McCoy leaves behind his one of his devices. I think it's his communicator. And, we wonder, gosh, whatever happened to those people, right? And then we never sort of get back there. And I know that was a story concept that some of the other series looked at and maybe they tried to get some scripts through, but never did. And I agree with you that one of the most amazing things about this episode is that it just starts right from the future, right?
Yeah.
They came in the past. This other thing happened. Here's where we are. And you never, well, I don't want to say you never, but you get a taste of what actually had happened, but it's told in flashback.
Well, it's
right?
told
it's very
actually from
different.
the Doctor's simulation, right? Or no, there is a point where they kind of flashback beyond that. But yeah, I mean, like what's supposed to be happening as the present, like isn't really the focus like whatsoever of the episode, which I think is a bold thing to do.
Gotcha. Yeah. Balance of Terror, big fan favorite. Mm-hmm. Tell me.
Yeah, I love that episode. I mean, again, we talked about the Enterprise incident as the other Romulan episode in the original series. You know, like for that episode, it's basically, I don't even know how to describe how I feel about it, but there's just something about the conflict that happens, and for the Romulan commander, I think played brilliantly by Mark Leonard. You can see just in like this short performance the things that he's trying to do in order to accommodate, you know, what his culture and his position demands, but at the same time, he, I think, is coming to really respect what Kirk is doing. I don't know. There's just something about the conflict that's just so very compelling. And yeah, it has a battle and there's actions, but I think like the really compelling part of it is the interaction between Kirk and the Romulan commander, where they're on these opposite sides, but kind of trying to come to something different, like in the midst of this whole conflict. I just love the episode.
I love the episode too. And I just want to throw in my tribute to the incredible dignity and gravitas that Mark Leonard brought to that role, and to Sarek. It's something that I think has been unmatched, I think, by any of the other attempts to play Sarek.
I agree, actually. Yeah.
Just, you know, he just had this incredible presence that you just felt it when the guy spoke. And he could have, you know, he's one of these actors that I think he could have been, you know, reading out of the dictionary, or, you know, delivering milk as the milkman or something. And I just would have been like, wow, that was amazing.
Yeah.
You know,
and I'm always so pleased that, you know, he was on The Next Generation as well, playing, you know, this older Sarek, and he was in the movies and all that. But yeah, I think that's the right word. The gravitas that he brings to all of these roles is just like, I mean, it's hard to compare, and I love that, and everything he brings to this role for the first time that we see Romulans helps to kind of define that.
Yeah, he really played Sarek with less is more, you know. Mm-hmm. And my favorite little bit of his, I can't remember if I've talked about it on the podcast before, so I beg my listeners' forgiveness for this, but I remember the scene in Star Trek 3 where he goes to Kirk's apartment, and that whole scene is just less is more. You know, he doesn't play it over much. And I think they got away from that in a lot of Enterprise with the Vulcans, the Star Trek Enterprise. You know, the Vulcans, I think, were pushed a little bit more. They were a little bit more emotional. There was more emotion on the surface, whereas Sarek was very much submerged in his emotions, but yet they came through. It was a really fine balancing act, and I have tremendous respect for his acting talent, and was so glad to see him in any of the roles that he was on. In that, although, you know, his role as the Klingon captain in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, I think that was
you get to learn as much about him. But I think it's cool that he could also play a Klingon.
Yeah, with his cool 70s hair. All right, so I got to challenge you on this next one, sure. Justin, because I got to admit I'm struggling. So the episode is What's Past is Prologue, which I believe is episode 14 of Discovery.
13, I think, yeah.
That. But very close to the end. So tell me why you think this is one of the best episodes of Discovery.
Well, I think it is the best episode of Discovery. And I think here's the interesting thing about it. So like I had seen it the first time and I was just blown away by this episode for a couple of reasons. I think the Mirror Universe arc in Discovery is really excellent. And this is kind of putting the cap on that, or it's the last one where they return to the Prime Universe. But like, I think the first time that I saw it, I think the confrontation is really great in the episode, but I think and the kind of inspiration that Saru gives to the crew in his speech, I think it's a really exciting episode. And one of the things that I love as well is when they're going back to the Prime Universe, and Stamets is seeing all of these kind of parts of the mycelial network. I think it's beautiful, and it's just like hypnotic for me to see that, and really amazing. Now, what's interesting is I just rewatched it recently. I don't know if anymore I would put it quite that high, but I think it is a really excellent episode and the best in Discovery. I think there were a lot of things that they were putting together in this episode that just had a really strong impact on me, and that I thought, after the first time I had seen it, wow, this is one of the best episodes in Star Trek, even though I think it's quite different than the other ones we've talked about.
As part of the prep that I do for each podcast, I rewatch all the episodes we're going to talk about. And I also do some of the background on some of the episodes to make sure I understand a little bit about the production and some of the issues that were involved. In researching this episode, I came across a couple of interesting reviews of it, and I want to offer one of them to you as a provocation, and maybe we'll see what we want to do with it or if we want to explore it further. Essentially, this is just a straight up action adventure episode, and in the middle of it, we have essentially 10 minutes of a Marvel Wachowski / Matrix fight scene that's just about spending a lot of budget, looking pretty, and has very little Star Trek in it. How would you respond to that?
I didn't see it that way. And I think there's lots of places in Star Trek where you have maybe not a scene quite like this, but where you do have these different battle scenes. I mean, I think one of my favorite things in all of Star Trek is the battle scene in what is it? It's a Deep Space Nine episode, Sacrifice of Angels, because it's just incredible. There's hundreds of ships fighting each other. It's not necessarily like the core of Star Trek, but those kinds of things I think would happen. And I think I don't know. I see it as integral to the episode. What's happening with the confrontation there? I enjoyed it. It didn't bother me, but I could see how somebody could say, "Hey, just cut that," and it's not needed. But it didn't take away from it for me.
Okay, fair enough. We'll probably come back to this at some other point on the podcast, because I do have a different thought on it. But it's not an issue that's Star Trek related. It's more of how they make media today. The part of that criticism that does stick with me is that I think that all fight scenes in a lot of popular media today are right out of the Matrix, right? Everybody's trying to be the Wachowskis. And there's been parts of my life when I was a much younger man where I was in situations where I was exposed to actual street violence, and people are not kicking knives out of the air.
Of course not.
It's more like it's more like the fight scene, if you've ever seen it, in Deadwood between Dan and the captain in season 3 of Deadwood, which is not a scene I would recommend that anyone go watch unless you have a very strong stomach. It's much more visceral than anything I've ever seen on TV. But that's what it looks like. It's not this acrobatic sort of stuff that you see. And so that always takes me out of the episodes. And but that's not a criticism of Star Trek. It's like how they make TV and movies today. But anyway, let's move on. The next thing you've picked is a little bit unconventional, which I love, is you've picked the Vulcan arc from Enterprise, the Forge / Awakening / Kirshara. And by way of introduction, I have to say big shout out to Enterprise Extra on the Twitter, because he was in the Awakening as the Enterprise Extra. So no mention of that episode can go without mentioning that. Best raising of shields and arming of the phasers ever in all of Star Trek, of course. Yeah. But tell me about this arc and why you selected it to be in the best episodes of all Star Trek.
Well, I mean, I think those are my 3 favorite episodes in Enterprise, and it's way up there for me as the best in Star Trek. I think for a couple of reasons. So I think you touched on it before, where it seemed like the Vulcans that we were seeing in Enterprise were maybe more emotive or a little bit different than we've seen before. I mean, this helps to provide an explanation for that, because there's kind of a certain kind of Vulcan that is leading the high command and kind of pushing things along. And also that there are these, the real teachings of Surak that have been kind of lost. And I think it's really excellent for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think it's a very well put together 3-episode arc. It doesn't feel like, you could do it in 2 episodes, or that's too much or too little. But, I've always had a fascination with Vulcan and its history. And this kind of touches on that history, and you get to, at least I guess through his Katra, see Surak. And Surak is this kind of important philosophical figure in Vulcan history that I find to be very inspirational. I mean, in fact, my all-time favorite Star Trek novel is Spock's World. And in that, there's a section where it's kind of going back into the past, and you're seeing like who Surak was and what his teachings were like. And there's a part in that novel that may be my favorite thing in any novel, because it contains such incredibly relevant and profound wisdom, even for our own time. So I think of it partly in that context, but I just love the idea of, this important philosophical figure that through the power of his words helped to kind of change a whole society, and that those teachings were lost, and they're kind of finding it again. I mean, I love in Kirshara that there's this there's this sense like things have been a certain way, they've lost their way, but they're going to regain it through these teachings of someone who's long dead by the power of his words, and that things are going to be different. And that's where you see T'Pau, take power, and they're going to not really watch the humans quite as much. And this kind of lays, some of the groundwork for the Coalition of Planets and the Federation. I love any delving into Vulcan, and this is probably the most that we ever see because it's part of a full 3-episode arc. And I love seeing where things are going, and I think it's very inspirational in kind of seeing some of the pieces that will get you to that Federation. So that's why I love it.
I'd agree with you on everything you just said, although I feel like the one thing I'll say is that the one thing that left me a little bit, I don't want to say unfulfilled because that's wrong, but the thing I wanted more of that we didn't get was I always wanted more of Andoria. Not so much Shran. I love Shran, but it's not about him. I always wanted to learn more about what was going on in Andoria and sort of what their politics was like and what was going on back there and how their whole government and society was structured. I felt like we only ever got teases and we never really got the full meal. And I think this episode, this arc, more than anything else I saw, really left me wanting more of them. And I just thought they were so interesting. And I just felt like I wanted a lot more of what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think certainly we got more of Andorians in Enterprise than we had really seen elsewhere before. But yeah, they're one of those really fascinating species that it still, I agree, wasn't quite enough. I mean, they go into it, I think, quite a bit more in the novels, which is excellent. And I enjoy that part of it. But I think we need to see more on screen of, their culture and their planet and what's going on and all of that. But yeah, and I was rewatching Kirshar and I was like, oh, I forgot Shran was in this. This is great. It's always great when Shran's there. So yeah, but I'm completely with you. Wouldn't it have, I mean, there was the arc about the Enar, but that wasn't really about the Andorians proper that we think of. And it would have been nice maybe to have a 3-episode arc about that, right?
I agree with you. So, but I guess that's part of the skill of making TV, right? Always wanting more. Yeah. All right. So let's change our axis of discussion here and let's move from best episodes to the episodes that maybe are meaningful to you, which there might be some overlap. There may not be. Let's see how we do. And I'm going to choose from this list. Let's start with Dear Doctor from Enterprise. Certainly a very interesting episode, and certainly an episode that has a lot to chew over. So this, of course, is the one where we follow Dr. Phlox, really, and we go through his day, and there's this alien planet we come across that's having a plague, and the question before us in the episode is whether or not the Doctor should cure the plague because we feel like we're led to believe that nature might be taking its course with this plague, and there's an ethical dilemma about whether or not to help the people on the planet. So tell me why this episode is meaningful to you, Justin.
Well, I mean, I think I love it for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think one of the ones that you touched on where we get to see kind of a day in the life of Phlox, where he's writing this letter to a human doctor that's on Denobula. Phlox is my favorite character on Enterprise, and I think that I can really relate to what he's going through in this episode. I think his character overall, because he is this alien, but he's kind of fascinated by humans and their culture. And Denobulans have a certain way of doing things. Their marriage structure and relationship structure is different. The way that they think about certain things is different. They've been able to kind of deal with genetic engineering in a way that Earth hasn't been able to deal with. So I find them really fascinating, but I can also relate to Phlox because he has this serious ethical dilemma in this episode, and I think it's such a difficult thing to think about because it's like, should we help these people that are suffering right now, or are we doing more harm because in doing so it'll help to suppress what is going on with this other species, the Menk, that are going to kind of flower and come into their own. I love a lot of the ethical dilemma episodes in Star Trek. And I mean, it's meaningful for me because I like thinking about those things. Like, what would I do in that situation? Because I'm continually, I think, trying to challenge myself in the things that I do. I mean, certainly haven't had anything like Phlox has to deal with, but in the things that I do in my everyday life, am I always doing the thing that's most ethical or for the best? I'm just constantly questioning that. And I can relate to what Phlox has to deal with. He almost doesn't tell Archer about what's really going on. But in the end, he does, and he feels like they make the right decision. But at the same time, it's kind of a heartbreaking decision because there are people that will suffer and die because of it, right? But it's being done for this longer term implication that they feel could do more harm. So I just relate to it because I'm often thinking of ethical considerations, even if the decisions I make in my own life don't have as far-reaching an impact.
Justin, I want to be very careful about how I proceed here because there's something I want to talk about with this episode that can get me in a lot of hot water. So I just want to be very delicate about how I proceed here. As I rewatch this episode and getting ready to talk with you, which I do for all the episodes that are going to come up on Trek Profiles that I know about ahead of time, I saw a lesson that I think is very relevant to how we sit here today. And I want to see how it sits with you, which is this is before the Prime Directive in Enterprise, right? And they make and Archer makes an allusion to it. He's like, at some point, they're going to create a directive. Yeah, some kind of first or really important directive, right? That tells us how we're going to relate with this. And so you have a situation of the moment where we have this problem with these people right in front of us who want our help. And this is the thing that's happening right now in the moment. And Phlox is looking at it from this big perspective of hundreds and thousands of years. Like, where is this society going? Where is this planet going? What are the evolutionary impacts of what's happening here? So he's like a big picture guy. And Archer is very narrowly looking at the right now and what's in front of me. And that is I don't want to say problem. It's an issue that I struggle with because I have a lot of friends, and I'm sure you do too, that are very much today in July 2018 as we record this, that are getting wrapped around the axle about things that are happening right now today in human society. And I appreciate and recognize their passion around those things. I very much struggle to keep myself abreast of the long arc of human history, and I try to, as much as I can, think about things on the tens, hundreds, or thousands of year scale. And when I do that, it's harder for me to get really spun up about things that are basically today's outrage of the day. Recognizing that other people make different choices. But that is something that struck me as I watched the episode too, is that this different timescale interpretation of how you view these things changes the ethics of what's actually happening in some very powerful and profound ways. And it was a real lesson for me about what Star Trek is about, which is Star Trek can change your life. It does change lives. And this episode, I saw an example of that, that the whole way we can interpret things that are happening in the world can change based on the timescale. And this was that story told in a very compact, very elegant way. And I just thought it was very powerful for me. And I want to thank you for bringing it up because it had some strong resonance for me. So that's just me expressing my appreciation. And I know that it wasn't intentional on your part, but it was something that happened as a byproduct of you making that episode meaningful for you. And it really had an impact on me as I watched it. Because the last time, honestly, that I'd seen the episode, I got to tell you, was in first broadcast. Thank you for bringing that.
Oh, wow. I'm glad that it... just in suggesting that there was something meaningful for you in it. So the way that I think about it is, I think there's different categories of what people are getting passionate about right now. There are certain things that are just like temporary things that are going to pass, and there are things that can have other consequences to them, right? Like when I think of like what's happening right now, there might be outrage about a certain thing that someone said, which might pass in 20 minutes or an hour, whatever, a day. But then there are other actions that can have consequences where people can get harmed or be killed that I think we have to like be aware of and be passionate about today in the moment, right? And we do need to think about certain things longer term because I think especially in America, we often haven't thought of things long term like, oh, what should we prepare for in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? We don't tend to think on that scale, and it's important to do that. But at the same time, I think we do need to kind of think about and be passionate about the things that that are of the most consequence, policies and actions that can lead to real harm right now. But I think is another category where it's like the tempest in a teapot of the moment that's going to pass, right? And people are getting maybe more worked up about that than the other things that have consequence.
Justin, I agree with you. It was a powerful episode, and I don't know what else to say about it, but I think that you're right. And I think that it's a little bit of a both and rather than an and or. Little call back to Andoria right there. That was cute. I didn't even intend to do that. That's beautiful. I'm going to leave that in. But I think you're right. It's a balancing act. And we have to look at the things in the moment and the long arc of history. But I thought it was really interesting how Archer changed his point of view in the episode, right? And I give him big props for that, too, because it takes a big person to reconsider, especially on such a big issue as that. So anyway, I thought it was a great episode. Let's talk about a Voyager episode. We haven't talked that much about Voyager except for Living Witness. Let's talk about The Void. Certainly a very positive episode. So this is the one, of course, where Voyager gets sucked into this dark place and they have to work with a bunch of aliens to escape this area of space where they can't get any supplies or refuel. So tell me why this episode was meaningful to you.
Yeah, I absolutely love this episode. And it's, again, a Voyager episode I hadn't seen until I was like, okay, let me sit down and watch all of the episodes that I've missed until a couple of years ago. And it's really meaningful for me because, like, I think one of the ways sometimes that we think about things, even in Star Trek, is, okay, we have these certain principles, but when your back's to the wall or your civilization's about to be destroyed, those things need to be bent. And Janeway, I think, is very consistent in this episode. And this is probably my favorite episode as far as Janeway goes, because continually through the episode, it's like, we need to form alliances. It's almost like they have a little mini federation in this void, and we need to stick to our principles. And I mean, I think even initially Chakotay and Tuvok are like, are you really sure? And Janeway's like, well, maybe we can do that and we'll be dead in a week instead of 2 days. Let's try this out. Maybe something will work. But I love how she sticks to her principles. She even kicks people out of this little mini federation because they're doing things where she would be an accessory to murder because of the things they're doing. And in the end, they end up getting out of the void with these other ships that kind of also believed in them. I think it's very inspirational. And I feel like, of course, I haven't been in this kind of situation, but I almost feel to a certain extent that you have to have like certain principles or morals for the way that you're doing things. And what is more difficult, violating those and having to live with it, or dying because of your principles? And I love that she takes that stance. Like, we may die here because of our principles, but that's all that we have left. So I find it to be like very inspirational and kind of testing those Federation ideals to the limit and still being successful in those. And also in watching the episode, it made me think, I wish the entire concept of Voyager was different. That instead they had gotten to the Delta Quadrant, seen it was going to be a long time getting home, and instead they formed alliances and made like a little mini federation to actually live out their lives in the Delta Quadrant. I would have loved to see that. And that's one of the things I like in Enterprise too, where you're kind of seeing these alliances being built and the Federation being built, and I like seeing more of that. And yeah, I just take inspiration from the Void that, maybe there's a certain element in that we can take inspiration from to try to have something that might be a better future, that actually by sticking to our principles that can make us stronger and help us out of difficult situations more than kind of sinking to a certain level. Beautiful.
And it is a beautiful episode, and it really does show the beauty of her principles, right? Because I think the hardest moment was they needed some piece of technology to escape, and one of their cohorts shows up with it, and they're like, oh, this is the thing we needed to escape. Yeah. How did you get it? And the guy basically says, well, I blew up another ship and took it from them. And she's like, well, we need to give it back to them. And he's like, nope, they're all dead. And she's like, well, even then, I still won't use it. Get it off my ship.
Yeah, I'm going to find another way, right? Yeah.
That's a hard call.
Yeah, but I love her for making that call. And I think one of the criticisms I have of Voyager is it can be inconsistent in things, and I see her character as like she's adapting and changing the circumstances, but she is like most hardcore about her principles in this episode, and I love it. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if it was like that the whole way.
Okay, Justin. So we've talked about your fandom. We've talked about how you live that fandom and the various ways that you explore that in your life. We've talked about the best episodes. We've talked about some of the episodes that you find meaningful, but there's one more meaningful episode I think we should touch upon before we move on, and that's Far Beyond the Stars. So tell me about that episode and why it's so meaningful to you.
Yeah, this is one that's very meaningful to me, and I mean, maybe it depends on whether I've just seen it. I might consider it the best in Star Trek or my favorite in Star Trek, maybe even over in the Pale Moonlight sometimes. But there's a couple of things that I really love about it. I mean, I think that there are explorations of the consequences of racism in different parts of Star Trek, but I feel like this is the episode where it hits it the most head on. And I mean, in the episode, basically the prophets are giving Sisko this vision of being Benny Russell, this sci-fi writer in the 50s, because I guess some of his enthusiasm about the war is really flagging. And what you see within the episode is that Benny Russell is someone who, has this brilliant concept for this thing, Deep Space Nine, and he writes stories about it. But in the end, they're going to deny publishing it because they can't have an African-American captain, even in a dream at that point, being someone in command. And one of the things about that episode, I mean, there's just, I could probably talk about it for a while, but it's unfortunately still very relevant. I mean, there's one scene in there where the character that's played by the actor who plays Jake Sisko, Sirach Lofton, he's trying to break into a car and the police shoot him. And unfortunately, these kinds of things where I think they say like, oh, he had a weapon. These kinds of things still happen today, all of these years later, sadly. And racism and discrimination and people getting shot because of that is unfortunately a reality still in our times. And also the scene where Benny Russell really breaks down, where, he's in the office, they've denied him having his story published. I think some people see it as like way over the top or melodramatic, but I always cry during that scene because I feel like that's the character of Benny Russell and Avery Brooks himself letting out anger and frustration for hundreds and hundreds of years of things that are unjust, unfair, and racist. It's kind of like the ultimate, it feels like I see it as like the ultimate channeling of all of that. And I think it's very powerful, and it makes me cry every time because things like that, not quite the same way, like not having your story published, but things where, an entire group of people is treated in a different way and is harmed and put in jail and killed because of the way that other people think about them still happens, and it still happens far too often. So I think it's an incredibly powerful episode that's just so meaningful to me because I think it's the ultimate expression in Star Trek of the real consequences and harm of those things.
Whenever this episode comes up, one of the things I always have to ask about, what is your interpretation of the final scene of the episode where we see Benny Russell reflected in the window?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see that is that it's kind of a reminder. Well, let me go back a little bit. I mean, I think there's also the question, like, why are the prophets doing this, right? So at the beginning of the episode, there is, a specific captain who's had his ship destroyed, and it's that Sisko knew really well, and it's just made him distraught. This whole war is kind of grinding him down, right? And I think the prophets are giving him this vision because in seeing this previous period where there is this racism and oppression going on, I think it's to inspire Sisko, like the Dominion is that force that would do the same thing to the people, to the Bajorans and to the people in the Federation. I mean, I think at one point later, Wyun says, oh, if there's a rebellion on Earth after we conquer it, we'll just, kill all of them, right? They're these really brutal people. And I think it's to inspire him. And I think that reflection at the end is to remind him there is some of that figure of Benny Russell that had that experience within him. And he needs to have the strength and the courage to fight against that, to prevent basically everyone in the Federation becoming that kind of second-class citizen. That's how I see it.
It's certainly a beautiful episode with some profoundly wonderful messages, and I think an implicit challenge, I think, to the viewer to reassess how we're living our own lives and the actions that we're taking to make the world a better place, which I think is something that is inherent in all the best of Star Trek, which is a challenge to the viewer to rethink what they're doing and how they're living their lives to try to be better. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, for me as a viewer, it's always challenged me. How can we make things better? Why are these things that I see in this episode that's supposed to, be a vision taking place almost 60 years before? Why is that still happening? What can we do about that? And sometimes I have some difficulty because I have things, going on in my own life to make sure that I survive, and I need to think about like what the best thing to do is. I'm not sure if I've necessarily found the way, but it always makes me think about that. And I think the best Star Trek does that. It makes you think about what's happening right now in the world and in your own life, and it makes you reflect on it, which I think is a special thing.
Well, I can think of no better note than to bring this episode into its final phase, Justin, because I've enjoyed talking with you, but I have to tell you that the M5 is now signaling me that it is time for the Kobayashi Maru. It is a challenging and difficult test, cunningly prepared by the M5. And Justin, should you not only survive the test, but pass it as well, the M5 will award you an honorary Star Trek title. Are you ready, Justin?
Oh, I'm ready.
M5, load the Kobayashi Maru simulation and prepare to record Justin's responses.
Working. Simulation loaded and ready for use.
Question 1. You're a freshman at Starfleet Academy. You get to pick your roommate, Wesley Crusher or Tom Paris.
Tom Paris.
Which Vulcan brings the logic, Tuvok or T'Pol?
Tuvok.
Part of Starfleet is diplomacy. You're at a reception for the Ferengi ambassador, and they are serving tube grubs. You'd better eat some, or you'll insult the ambassador. You can either have the mushy ones or the crunchy ones. Take your pick.
Crunchy.
Alamarane count to 4, or hail, hail, fire, and snow?
Oh, Alamarane count to 4.
You've entered a darts competition at Quark's Bar, but you lost. However, there is a consolation prize. Would you rather have 100 gross of self-sealing stem bolts or 5,000 rapages of Cardassian yamak sauce?
Oh, the stem bolts.
Simulation complete. M5, please compute the results and tell us if our guest has passed the Kobayashi Maru.
Results posted.
Justin, I am pleased to tell you that the M5 has calculated that you have passed the Kobayashi Maru simulation. Congratulations.
Thank you. Glad I could make it out to the other side.
And now, the M5, who has analyzed your answers, will award you an honorary Star Trek title on behalf of our podcast. M5, what title shall we award our guest?
Justin is awarded the title of Lieutenant Governor of Cestus 3.
So there you go.
Sounds good. Let's play some baseball there.
All right, excellent. That's right. We'll invite Cisco to come watch.
Yeah, and Cassidy Yates.
Justin, absolutely, they'll love it, right? We'll get the hats and everything. Justin, please tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Well, you can find me co-hosting Earl Grey on Trek FM, which is our dedicated TNG podcast. We have a great time talking about the next generation every week. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek.
Outstanding. Justin, thank you so much for being part of Trek Profiles podcast.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here.
Here ends this installment of the Trek Profiles podcast, and before we offer a Trek quote to close this episode, I'd like to remind you that you may send us your thoughtful feedback, helpful suggestions, or pledges of allegiance and fealty to the M5 Multitronic unit to feedback@trekprofiles.com or on Facebook or Twitter at Trek Profiles. Anything you send us may be used in the show or may be thrown randomly into history through the Guardian of Forever. This week, I leave you with a quote from Captain Picard, who in the episode The Offspring said, quote, "There are times, sir, when men of good conscience cannot blindly follow orders. You acknowledge their sentience, but ignore their personal liberties and freedom. Order a man to turn his child over to the state? Not while I am his captain." Unquote. Thanks for listening, and live long and prosper.